So I took the job and got to Sacramento. Well, I hadn't been there very long. It was 1960 when I arrived. Hadn't been there very long. I'm sitting at my desk, and the director, Cal Axford, comes in. He says, Arthur, he says, we just got a request from the United Way. There's a sheltered workshop for retarded people down somewhere in south of the city. And the United Way wants us to do an evaluation, make recommendations to them. And I'm going on vacation. I'll be gone for a couple of weeks. And they want our recommendations in a couple of weeks. So I can't do it. So you have to do it. And I said, oh, Cal, I don't know anything about sheltered workshops. I don't know anything about mental retardation. Did we just stall them, till you get back? He says, no, he says, I don't want to mess with them. They want it, we're going to give it to them. You're on your own, kid. Go have a good time. And he leaves, and here I am. So I go down to see this sheltered workshop. Well, they got a big room, and they got about 15 people around a table, and they're doing something with paper, stuffing envelopes or something, and chatting with each other and laughing. And there are some parents there who sort of are overseeing what's going on. And I talk to the parents, and they've got very little money. They've raised money with cookie sales and stuff, and they've got very little money. They got some little contract with somebody to do some envelope stuffing or something, but they really need the money. And, they're struggling. They've set up this program, but it's hard to finance it. And, they just need help. Well, I was very impressed with what they had done. I mean, imagine these people have faced a difficult challenge. Having a child with a significant disability is such a challenge. And they've banded together, and they're doing something. And the people who were at this workshop, I would spend a day watching them, and they're enjoying being there. They seem happy. So I was very impressed. And I wrote a recommendation to the United Way that they should be funded, which they were. Now, just at that time, along comes, in 1960, a new president in the United States, Jack Kennedy. And Kennedy had a mentally retarded sister, Rosemary, and was very interested in doing something. And this is an issue that had not been dealt with. It was something people didn't want to talk about. It was in the closet, if you will. And Kennedy wanted to bring it out of the closet. So he set up a president's panel on mental retardation. And they looked around the country to see who knew anything, what was going on. And they heard about this study. And I got invited to go to Washington and to meet with the president's panel and present our recommendations. And then there's this article comes out in the Sacramento Bee, Community Welfare Council's proposal for an integrated diagnostic counseling daycare service for the mentally retarded has attracted national attention. The council assistant director, Art Bolton, who recently presented the idea to President Kennedy's panel on mental retardation, said the meeting in Washington, D.C. assured him we were on the right track. Okay, so the groundwork is sort of laid there. And then what happens in '62, three ladies, Pat Dunbar, who was one of the Sacramento people who had set up this workshop and all, and whose husband just happened to be the director of the State Department of Corrections. And she had a son in Sonoma State Hospital. She and Vivian Walters. Vivian Walter was a wealthy woman, lived in Tiburon overlooking the bay. Right. And one of her good friends was Eunice Shriver, nice. The president's sister, who was involved in all this stuff. And Elizabeth Berger, who at the time was the president of the California Mental Health Association. So these three ladies went around looking at the state hospitals because they were concerned about the conditions, and the hospitals were overcrowded. In 1960, 62, there were between 13 and 14,000 residents in the state institutions and a waiting list of 2,000 to get in. And there was a constant waiting list because as soon as somebody left, somebody was waiting to come in. And the population in California was growing real fast. So this problem was growing. And the ladies went around, looked at the institutions, and they went to the press. God bless the newspapers. And the newspapers had headline stories. You know, state hospitals called snake pits, blah, blah, blah. And the governor at the time, Jerry Brown's dad, Pat Brown Sr., was embarrassed because after all, they're his state hospitals. And so he turned to the experts on his staff, the State Department of Mental Hygiene, which ran the state hospitals, and said, "What do I do?" And they said, "Governor, we've been telling you the conditions are bad. There is this waiting list. We have got to build more hospitals. But they shouldn't be so huge. 500 beds, that's enough. We'll build a bunch of 500-bed hospitals." And the governor said, "Fine." And he went to his Department of Finance and said, "Put some money in the budget, next year's budget for that." And they put $47 million in to begin the construction of additional state hospitals. Well, the parents, the families, Dunbar, Berger, and Walter, plus all the others up and down the state, Lottie Moise from
or Fort Bragg.
Fort Bragg. There were Dick Koch down in L.A. I mean, all listened to this governor's proposal and said, that's not what we want. We want something in the community. We want good services in the community. And the governor wasn't interested in that. He wanted a quick fix, build more. And he was into building stuff. Governor Pat Brown did great. Built the state aqueduct, built colleges, universities. Right. So he liked building stuff. So the families went to Jess Unruh, who was the Speaker of the Assembly. Not an ordinary man. They call him Big Daddy. There's a book out called Big Daddy, which is about Jess Unruh. And a lot of this story is in that book, written by a wonderful newspaper guy, Bill Boyarsky from the LA Times. And anyway, they went to the speaker, Unruh, and they explained their problem, and he said, well, we'll look into it. And he appointed a committee to look into it. Not just any committee. It was Jerry Waldy, who at the time was the top Democrat, I forget what you call him.
Speaker of the Assembly, or
He
something?
wasn't Speaker of the Assembly, he was Majority Leader.
Got it.
Yeah. And he was a liberal Democrat. And Nick Petras, who was a really bright guy, a lawyer from Alameda. And then, in order to have it bipartisan, there was old Frank Lanterman, who'd been in the legislature for 15, 16 years, a conservative guy when it came to money, but a guy with a big heart. And that was the committee. And so they had a hearing or two and sort of puttered around, and they realized they were in deeper than, I mean, this was something that required more study. So, next thing I know, I get a phone call from Larry Margolis, who is the chief assistant to the Speaker Unruh. And he says he'd like to meet with her, and they want to talk about a job, and go meet with him at the Capitol. And so I get ready to go meet him, and that day, and he calls and says, "Yeah, I'm sorry, Art. So I can't meet you at the Capitol. I'll meet you in the waiting room at Sutter Hospital. My wife's having a baby." So I go to the waiting room and meet with this guy. And he's a smart political operator. He's been with Unruh for years, helped Unruh with his run for the Assembly, and worked with Unruh at University of Southern California, where Unruh went to school. And he explains to me what this is about, this mental retardation study. And he says, "I understand that you went to the president's panel." And I said, "Yeah, I'm being modest." and he said, "Well, that's very impressive." And he says, "Well, if you want this job, it's not an easy job, and you work in the legislature and the politics involved." I said, "Look, I don't know if I would enjoy this job. I don't know if I'd like to work for a bunch of politicians. That's not my thing. And I mean, if it's a serious thing, that's something else. If it's just fluff to look good, I don't know. So, I mean, why don't we leave it that I would take it under two conditions. One, that my current job, which I love, will take me back if it doesn't work out in a few months. I would just leave and I'd have a place to go. That's the first condition. The second condition is, it sounds like I'd be working my tail off, and I would want to get paid good because, I've got a family and all." And he said, "Well, yeah, how much would you want?" I said, "I wouldn't take this job for less than $1,000 a month." Because I was making at the time $700, I think. And he said, "I think we can arrange that." So next thing I know, I'm staff to Mr. Waldy's committee. And that begins a very interesting, exciting adventure for me. Working with three smart, tough legislators working on a very controversial issue, and opportunity to meet with these wonderful parents around the state. And they really were the ones that we turned to for advice and information. They knew what life was like, what it was all about, what was needed. We didn't know. We just opened up the avenues of communication. And so we started looking at the hospitals. And the first thing that we did was we visited hospitals. And I remember taking Frank Lanterman, who was an overweight guy, a little bit like Chris Christie, and he looked like Santa Claus, actually. A little pug nose, rosy cheeks. And he was a conservative Republican from La Cañada. And I remember hiking up the hill with him to go to some of the wards in the hospital. And it's hilly there. And he's sweating, and we go and look in this ward, and there's 100 people, one bed right next to the other, no room for personal stuff. Some of the people naked, and 3 harried-looking staff running around trying to keep people from hurting themselves. It was terrible. And Lanterman looked at it, he said, "I don't believe it." He said, "This is my California." He was many generations California, loved California. He said, "This is embarrassing, it's terrible. We have to change this." So then then Vivian Walter, I think, with her connections with what's her name? The president's sister, Eunice Shriver.
Right.
She brought 2 experts, world-renowned experts, in to look at the hospitals. Gunnar Dibwad, who was professor at Harvard, and Niels Bank Mikkelsen, who was in charge of Denmark's programs. And they came out and they also looked at the hospitals. And Nicholson's comment was, "We treat our cattle better in Denmark than you treat these people." And it was atrocious. So the next challenge was, how do we fix it? And I quickly came to the conclusion that was not what we wanted to do, because I didn't think you could fix it. For one thing, as soon as you built more hospitals, you'd have to build more because population's growing that fast. So it'd be, and Nick Petras, who had was a Greek heritage, told me the story about Sisyphus that I always enjoyed. Sisyphus was an evil king of Corinth, and when he died, the good forces sentenced him to hell because of his atrocious things that he did. And his punishment in hell was to push a large boulder up a hill which constantly rolled back. And Petrus said, "This is a Sisyphean struggle. If they want to build more of these places, as soon as we build them, we have to build more. And it costs a ton of money, and it's not what the people want." So we want something different. What? And then we had to invent a new system. And a few things made it easy for us. We had the advantage of starting from scratch. Most of the time when you're mucking around in government stuff and you want to make a change, it's hard to make any change. You can maybe change a little something here or there, but it doesn't matter that much. Why? Because people don't really like change. And when you want to change, it's threatening to them. And they like to defend, this is the way we do it, and we've always done it this way. And they're secure in what they know, and they're frightened of what they don't know. And so coming up with something new and different is always a painful exercise. And we had the advantage. There wasn't much, there weren't any toes to step on. There were a few private programs that families had put together, or a few private programs that wealthy people could use. But there was no system. We didn't have to battle the counties or any established agency. The Department of Mental Health, which was supposedly running this stuff, didn't have the foggiest idea what they were doing. They didn't understand what the needs of this population were. Most of them were trained as psychiatrists to do talk therapy or whatever. I mean, you know, right. What do they know about housing? What do they know about recreation services? I mean, so we really didn't have a hard road to travel to come up with something new. And what we came up with is the system that you have today. And it's a simple system. It uses the state contracting with a private agency, that's the regional center, to do certain things. Well, that is controversial because it removes certain power from the state and puts it elsewhere. The state doesn't like that. And a few years after the system went into effect, in fact, California State Employees Association, CSEA, sued the state because they said it was illegal to contract with a private agency to do the regional center function. That should be a state function using state employees. So it was a jobs issue for CSEA. They didn't get anywhere with that lawsuit, but it illustrates the difficulty in going, the road we went. But we were able to do it because we had the strength of all these families behind us. They'd get up and testify. When we came up with the idea of the regional center, I got a visit in my office from Dr. James Lowry, who was director of State Department of Mental Hygiene, a psychiatrist retired from Army service. And he said, I've read your stuff on a regional center. I think it's a great idea. It really is, it's what we need. And I'm happy to tell you, we're prepared to do it right now. We've got these state institutions all over the state. They can be the regional center. So the family can go to them, they're scattered around the state, and get diagnosis and counseling and whatever is needed. And we already have psychiatrists and other social workers on staff. Piece of cake. And it won't cost that much. So that's what I would recommend, that you change your proposal. And I remember going to one of the parents who I admired a great deal and got to know very well, David Sokolov, who was from Marin County. And I said, David, I need your advice on something. I got a call from Lowry, and he came to see me, and he wants to run the regional centers. What do you think? It didn't take him a second to react. He said, that is the worst idea I have ever heard. He said, would we trust those people who have fucked up this system for 150 years, trust them to do something new and different and better? No way, not going to happen. We don't trust them. In fact, we don't trust. Let's take the whole damn thing out of that department. And so one of the things we did in that reform effort was move the responsibility from the Department of Mental Hygiene over into the Department of Public Health for a temporary place under the Crippled Children's Program, Dr. Gardner. Right. So the regional center issue, we faced it, we overcame it. Then the next issue was, how are we going to provide services to people? I mean, usually what government does, if it identifies a service need, it sets up a service program to meet that need. That's why you've got 150 different programs for each different thing, but that's the way government does. But we don't want we don't know what these people are going to need. Some are going to need employment. Some are going to need housing. Some are going to need medical attention. I mean, how can we set it up? And so we thought about it and came up with not a novel idea, came up with something called the marketplace. How do other things happen? What you do is, in America, you say, we've got some money to spend if you will come up and meet this need. And so we set up the regional centers to be the purchasing agent for the services needed. How would we determine the services needed? By requiring an individual program plan. And that's really the heart of the system. It's the individual program plan that drives the decision about what services needed. And
were there precedents for that? I mean, did you see that elsewhere, or is that something that was unique to this situation?
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure. It's not a novel idea. I mean, it's sort of capitalism in a way. People want to make a buck, so they want to see what the public wants, and they provide it, and they make that buck. If the public doesn't buy it, they go out of business. So we set up this system so that it would provide diagnostic services, which were badly needed. These families would shop around trying to find somebody who could tell them what's wrong with their kid. The regional center would also provide counseling for a lifetime, if necessary, to this family. And it would administer an individual program plan to determine what each individual needed. And then they would go to the community and say, we are prepared to buy if you will provide because that's what the IPP calls for. And so it made it possible to get enormous diversity in services, that you weren't depending on any one agency to do everything. And it allowed for some flexibility and movement. If a program wasn't really doing the job, the regional center could always say, hey, you know, we're getting bad kickback from the families, this isn't happening, you better do something or we're going to drop our contract with you and go somewhere else. The Waldy Act, enacted in 1965, set up 2 regional centers to experiment to see whether the theory was appropriate, whether it would work. And the San Francisco Regional Center, under the direction of Ed Pye, who was a social worker, they saw almost 500 people all on the waiting list to the state hospital.
Wow.
And they were able to find suitable alternative community programs for all but 25 people. So there it was, there was the proof. And within a few years, in 1967, I think, the full statewide implementation was required, and it was then titled the Lanterman Act, and that set up the whole statewide network because we knew it was work.
Talk about that.
I know.
How did you get that approved?
The entitlement is crucial. It says that the state has a responsibility. If someone has a developmental disability, they can come into the system for free, and the state has a responsibility. How do we get that done? By just rather simple sleight of hand. The law already gave the state responsibility for this population when it said that if you had a developmental disability, the state would take care of you in a state hospital. And what we said was, well, the state already has the responsibility. We're just changing where that responsibility will take place. We're not adding a new responsibility. You know, we're just saying it could be in a less expensive place, in a better place. It's still the state's responsibility. So, and why take that away? That's a good thing, isn't it?
Yes.
So, I mean, that was not that hard because we already had precedent for the state being the responsible entity.